All right, so the digestive system. So when we study about the organs, okay, we always follow the path of something going in and then going out. In this case, we have the digestive system, which we're following the path of food going in and then going out. So we're going to call it the alimentary canal, okay, similar to the digestive tract. So where does food go in? It goes into the oral cavity, right, through the mouth. Okay, and remember, the mouth, there's going to be accessory organs there that are associated with your digestive system. You're going to have the teeth, you're going to have the tongue, you're going to have the salivary glands. Okay, so those are actually associated with the mouth. And then once the food is processed in the mouth, the next part of the food is going to be pushed to the back of the mouth, and the back of the mouth is called your pharynx. Okay, so the pharynx now takes the food in, and the tongue will push the food down to the esophagus. And remember, at this point, the throat that is actually held by the hyoid bone is going to lift the throat up by the hyoid bone, because at the back of the throat is your esophagus. So when the esophagus is lifted up, it's going to grab onto the food that was pushed back by your tongue. And then after that, it's going to go into the esophagus. And then from the esophagus, it then travels down into the stomach. Okay, so the food then goes to the stomach. Now the stomach will process the food again. Okay, and also there's acid in the stomach that will actually change the consistency of food. It's going to look like oatmeal. Okay, so at that point, the food is going to be called chyme once the stomach processes it. Okay, chyme. The food generally, once it passes through the mouth, pharynx, and esophagus, we call it a bolus. So when it goes to the stomach, it's going to look like oatmeal. We call it chyme. Okay, and then from the stomach, it's going to be pushed to the small intestinal tract. Okay, and your small intestinal tract is made out of three parts: the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum, DJI. Okay, so that you know the sequence, DJI. Okay, so generally the duodenum will still process the food because that's where the gallbladder connects. And remember, the gallbladder gets its bile from the liver, and then the pancreas will add in the pancreatic enzymes to further process the food and put it into small units. Okay, so just carbohydrates, you're going to take it and make it to glucose. Your proteins, you're going to convert it to amino acids. Your fats, which is lipids, triglycerides, you're going to convert to fatty acids. And that's actually done by your digestive tract in the duodenum, because the pancreatic enzymes is going to help out processing those food. Okay, so once the food becomes absorbable units, now it's going to transfer the food to the jejunum and the ileum. So the function of the jejunum and ileum is to absorb the nutrients that was processed by the stomach and your mouth and your small intestinal tract, the duodenum. Then once the nutrients are absorbed, then whatever comes out from the small intestinal tract that's going to be pushed to the large intestine, that's actually called waste. So the large intestine, what's there is going to be feces, okay? So they're not absorbable anymore. Now, you can divide the large intestine in smaller parts, okay? So I use the mnemonics CAT desire to say what are the different parts of your large intestinal tract. C is cecum, okay? And then A is ascending colon, so it's going up. And then T is transverse, so it's going horizontal. DE is descending colon, it's going down. Then S is sigmoid, so SI. So I use DE as descending, SI as sigmoid. It looks like an S-shaped colon. And then RE is rectum. Okay, so it's easy to actually see it, which is going to be CAT desire. Okay, so those are the sequence of the large intestinal tract. And then when everything's finished, rectum is a pouch that will sense fullness. So when rectum becomes full, it will then produce pain. And then you have to go to the toilet and dispose of it through the anus. Okay. So this is the path of the food, okay, from outside in and then outside. And this is actually called your alimentary canal. Just remember, we talk about your accessory digestive organs, okay? That is also part of the digestive system. That's going to be the teeth, tongue, gallbladder, salivary glands, liver, and the pancreas, okay? Now, let's visually identify those structures through these schematic diagrams, okay? So the mouth, oral cavity, is where the food is being processed. And then within the mouth, you can see the tongue and you can see the salivary glands. Okay, salivary glands, there's three of those salivary glands. The one underneath the tongue, we call it sublingual. Underneath the mandible, we call it submandibular. And then another one that's located in front of your ear, that's your parotid gland. Okay, so that's your parotid gland. Now just remember, the parotid gland sometimes becomes infected in childhood. Call it mumps. Okay, so mumps is a viral infection of the parotid gland. Okay, so why do you still have to vaccinate mumps? Mumps causes testicular infection in small male, okay, small kids that are male, because they actually notice that when somebody gets infected with mumps, okay, the virus can actually travel to the testes of the male. And then 10% of those that becomes infected is going to be infertile. Okay, so the vaccination that we provide for infants, okay, is MMR, measles, mumps, rubella. So that actually is one of the problems about these viruses. They actually cause havoc on other organs. Even though the infection is the parotid gland, which is going to be the salivary gland, it can actually infect also your testes, the place where sperm is produced. So from here, it goes to the back of the mouth. And the back of the mouth is called the pharynx. And then from there, it travels down into this tube called the esophagus. Okay. Now the tube will go to the thoracic cavity and then pass through the diaphragm, which separates the thoracic cavity and your abdominal cavity. And then it will connect now to the stomach. So the stomach has acid, okay, and it actually functions like a washing machine, so it ruminates the food around in the stomach. Okay. Now, when the food is finished in the stomach, it will actually have the consistency of what we call oatmeal, so it's going to be kind. And then from there, it's going to pass into the small intestinal tract, and the first one's called the duodenum. The duodenum is a small tube that looks like a letter C. So that is where the duodenum will then further process the food, okay? And whatever is connected to the duodenum is going to be the gallbladder connected to the duodenum. The pancreas secretion is also connected to the duodenum. So when everything is processed by the duodenum, the main thing that the jejunum, the ileum will do is absorb the nutrients. So this is the spiral structures of the small intestinal tract called jejunum and ileum. So by looking at it from the outside, you won't be able to differentiate where's the jejunum and where's the ileum. Okay, so the only thing you can identify is when the tube, the small intestine that connects from the duodenum, is going to be called the jejunum, and the ileum is a tube that connects to the large intestine, and that's going to be the ileum. Okay, so now from the ileum, it'll pass through a valve here called the ileocecal valve. And that valve will open up, and now the food is now at the large intestine. Remember, all the things that you see in the large intestine is going to be waste. That's feces. So the large intestine is going to be divided into cecum. That's the pouch where the ileum enters. And then you can see that there's something dangling down to that cecum, and that's called your appendix. So after the cecum, it'll go up to the colon called the ascending colon, A, and then it'll travel horizontal to the transverse colon, T, okay? And then from there, it's going to go down to the descending colon, this DE, and then we'll pass through this S-shaped structure called sigmoid colon, that's SI. Then the last one is going to be this pouch called the rectum, RE. Okay, so those are the structures that we need to identify, okay, on the alimentary canal. Okay. All right, so now let's take a look at what are the processes of the digestive system. Okay, so remember, this is more of physiology, but I'm just going to summarize what's happening in the digestive process. So the mouth is it's actually processing called ingestion. So remember, the mouth is teeth. It'll cut food, it'll tear the food, and it will grind the food within the teeth. Okay, and then from there, it's going to propel to the tubes. The tubes propulsion is called peristalsis. Okay, so it's going to travel from the mouth to the esophagus through what we call peristalsis, and then from there, it's going to go to the stomach. Okay, now what will the stomach do? The stomach is going to produce what we call chemical digestion. So generally, the mechanical digestion is actually done at the chewing and turning of food in the stomach. Okay, so the stomach still do some of the mechanical digestion, because I told you it's just like a washing machine. It's going to rotate and move around that organ. Okay, and the chemical digestion is also handled by the stomach, because it's going to put in acid, hydrochloric acid, in order to further process the food into something like chyme, which looks like oatmeal. Now, mouth has also some kind of chemical digestion, because at this point, the mouth now also secretes your saliva, which has enzymes called the salivary amylase. So the salivary amylase main purpose is to process the sugar. Amylo means starch. Okay, so that mouth still has some form of chemical digestion process. Okay, and then after that, from the stomach, it now goes to the small intestine and further produce what we call chemical digestion, which is handled by the gallbladder, has the bile, and your pancreatic enzyme that will actually further process the food into smaller absorbable subunits. Okay. Now, so some of the tracts, the alimentary canal, produce what we call segmentation. Segmentation is rhythmic local constriction of your intestine. So it's just like pushing it forward and then pushing it backward again, pushing it forward and pushing it backward. So that's what we call segmentation. Okay, because remember, at the point when you want to pass it through your intestine, you're still absorbing those nutrients that was processed by the stomach, by the salivary glands, and by your duodenum. So once it passes through your jejunum ileum, that will actually be segmentation. So you push it forward and push it backward, because you're trying to absorb as much as you can from the absorbable units that was processed by your digestive tract. Okay. So when food is now processed through chemical and mechanical digestion, absorption is a transfer of digestive nutrients from the walls of your intestinal tract. Remember, the walls of the intestinal tract is simple columnar epithelium. So those glucose, those amino acids, and those fatty acids will then be absorbed into the walls of your large intestinal tract at the simple columnar epithelium. And then from there, it's going to be transferred to the blood. Okay. Now, the blood is now carrying the nutrients. And remember, when the nutrients are absorbed by the blood, they have to pass through the hepatic portal vein. Okay. Because anything that's being absorbed will pass through the hepatic portal vein and then will be further processed by the liver. Okay. So the liver has some point of function in the absorption of the nutrients. So when the liver decides it's ready to be absorbed, it's ready to be distributed, it'll push it into the inferior vena cava through the hepatic vein. Okay? And we studied that when we went through our veins. Okay? And then when all food passing through the large intestine, those are waste materials, but sometimes water is generally absorbed in your large intestine. And then from there, it's going to go into the rectum. And rectum is a way for knowing fullness inside the rectum, because feces will produce what we call your uh, your items that can actually push the walls of the rectum. The rectum will sense that the stretching. It will then produce pain, and then from there it will allow the anus to open up. Okay, so this is what's happening within your digestive processes. Okay, now one thing is, remember I talked to you about the fats that are absorbed in your small intestinal tract. The fats do not pass through the blood vessel to the portal vein. The fats pass through the lymphatic vessel, through the intestinal trunk. Okay, so we went through that from the lymphatic system. Then from the intestinal tract, it's going to go into the lymphatic vessel and it goes to the subclavian vein. So it doesn't pass through the liver. Okay, it passes directly into the subclavian vein in order to be distributed in the plasma. Okay, now the structures within the cavity. Okay, now remember, when you say peritoneal cavity, it's different from abdominal cavity. Okay, so the abdominal cavity is the basic cavity between the abdomen and the pelvic area. Okay, but remember, there's a certain sac that is located in your abdominal cavity that is called the peritoneal cavity. So that sac is made out of the abdominal organs called the intestinal tract. And if you notice, it's covered by a membrane that wraps around the organ. And then from there, that membrane goes to that cavity, okay, where the visceral organs or abdominal organs locate that. So this membrane that wraps around the organs is called the visceral peritoneum. And the membrane that wraps the cavity here, okay, the walls of the cavity, is going to be parietal peritoneum. And between the parietal peritoneum and the visceral peritoneum, there exists a cavity there called the peritoneal cavity. Okay, so that's going to be your peritoneal cavity. Now, abdominal cavity is different from the peritoneal cavity because we'll see later on that some organs are located not inside the peritoneal cavity, right? So let's identify some of the structures that are seen within the peritoneal cavity. So there's going to be membranes that hold the abdominal organs to their dorsal wall. Okay, so they're dangling through the dorsal wall, and that is the dorsal mesentery. So there's nothing holding the abdominal organs to the ventral wall, okay, except for one organ, which is going to be the liver. So the liver has a connection to the ventral wall, so we call it the ventral mesentery. Okay, and here you have the abdominal organ that is held at the dorsal wall called the dorsal mesentery. Okay, so the liver, the only one, has the ventral mesentery, and that is actually one of the things that we look inside the peritoneal cavity. Okay, so we talked about the peritoneum. Those are serous membranes made out of the visceral. And the visceral peritoneum is the one that surrounds the digestive organs, and you have the parietal peritoneum that lines the body wall. Okay? And in between the two peritoneum is a slit-like potential space called the peritoneal cavity. And we notice that the mesentery, or double-layered peritoneum that holds organs in place, there's going to be a lot of those fats being stored within the mesentery. And also the mesentery is actually a route for the circulatory vessels and nerves to pass through inside the cavity. Okay, so taking a look at the difference between the abdominal cavity and the peritoneal cavity. So take a note on the kidney. So the kidney is an organ in the abdominal cavity. Okay, it's an organ in the abdominal cavity, but also with the abdominal aorta and the inferior vena cava. Okay, but they're not inside the peritoneal cavity. So the peritoneal cavity is the cavity that you see here. Okay, so remember there's two the membranes that is wrapping around the organ within that cavity. The membrane that wraps around the organ. Okay, this is called the visceral peritoneum, and then it turns around to wrap around that cavity. That's going to be your parietal peritoneum, and then between them is going to be the peritoneal cavity. Okay. Now, the structures, the kidney, the abdominal aorta, and inferior vena cava, they're not inside the peritoneal cavity. They're located outside the peritoneal cavity, and we call those organs retroperitoneal organs. So retroperitoneal organs are organs that are not inside the peritoneal cavity. Peritoneal organs are the digestive organs that keep their mesentery. Okay, so that's another terminology you have to distinguish between abdominal cavity and the peritoneal cavity. All right, so now we have the some of the mesenteries that we're gonna be identifying. Okay, so well, I'm gonna look at it in the frontal view, but it's gonna be easier if you take a look at the longitudinal view. Okay, so we're gonna identify some of the mesenteries here. So we have this lesser omentum, and the stomach has two curvatures. The one here is called the lesser curvature. Okay, and the opposite is going to be the greater curvature. Now there's going to be a mesentery that connects the lesser curvature of the stomach to the liver. So that mesentery is called the lesser omentum. Okay, so we're going to call that the lesser omentum. All right, so that's what a lesser omentum looks like. It's a mesentery connecting the lesser curvature to the liver. Okay, and just take note that the liver is pulled up, okay, in order to expose where the lesser omentum is attached. Now the other mesentery is called the greater omentum. Okay, it's a fatty apron of peritoneum, so it's very distinguishable. When you open up somebody's abdomen, the first thing you're going to see is that apron of fat called the greater omentum. So definitely the greater omentum is is a structure that is actually invading the whole peritoneal space. It looks like an apron. So the term greater omentum means it came from the greater curvature of the stomach, and then it attaches to the transverse colon. Okay, so as I said, it's better to look at it on a lateral view. Okay, so this is the greater omentum. So it looks like an apron that you can actually cover the whole anterior part of the abdominal cavity. So using this longitudinal view, okay, it's easy to identify the mesenteries. Okay, so let's take a look at the mesenteries here. So here is your stomach. Okay, the stomach. This part is the lesser curvature. The lesser curvature mesentery attaches there and then connects into the liver. So this is what we call the lesser omentum. Remember, it is a mesentery that attaches from the lesser curvature of the stomach into the liver. Okay. So it's more visible by looking at it in this view. Now, the opposite side of this part of the stomach is called the greater curvature. The greater curvature of the stomach. So the mesentery that attaches through the greater curvature of the stomach, and if you take a look, it goes down and then turns around and ends at the transverse colon. So this is called your transverse colon of the large intestinal tract. So the mesentery that starts from the greater curvature of the stomach, it turns up and around ends at the transverse colon. That is called the greater omentum. Okay. Now, other mesenteries that you can visibly see here is the falciform ligament. The falciform ligament is the mesentery that connects the liver to the ventral wall. Remember, we call this the ventral mesentery. It's the only one that attaches to the ventral wall. And then let's take a look at your intestinal tract. So this is your small intestinal tract that's coiled within the abdominal cavity or the peritoneal cavity. So the mesentery that holds that organ into the dorsal wall, that is called the mesentery, but sometimes we call it the mesentery proper. Okay, so it's holding on to the small intestines to the dorsal wall. Okay, now the mesentery that holds the transverse colon to the dorsal wall, that is called the transverse mesocolon. Okay, so these are the mesentery's sagittal section through the abdominal pelvic cavity, and that defines what mesenteries are. Okay, and that defines the organs that are located within the peritoneal cavity. Remember, the walls is lined by visceral peritoneum. Then after that, it turns around and go on each of the organs. Okay, so the peritoneum that wraps around each of the organs is called the visceral peritoneum. Okay, and then after that, turns around again, goes to the wall. And from here, it turns around and goes into the transverse colon, and that's actually what mesenteries are. All right, so now let's take a look at the alimentary canal. Okay, what are the layers of this digestive tube? So the inner layer, which is lined by simple columnar epithelium. Okay, the lining of the lumen. Lumen is actually the cavity within this alimentary canal. So it's lined by your simple columnar epithelium, and we saw that when we study your tissues. And then around that is going to be the lamina propria. Always, we have a lamina propria when there's an epithelium. And then we have a single layer around the structures here called the muscularis mucosa. So that layer is called the mucosa. Okay, it has an outer muscle layer, and it has the lamina propria underneath the epithelium. That's your mucosa. Okay. Now the next one is a layer called the submucosa. So the submucosa is from here to here. Now what is in the submucosa? Those are your gastric glands. Your intestinal glands. So glands are actually located at the submucosa, but their ducts excrete out into the mucosa. Okay. Now, the next layer is going to be the muscularis externa. The muscularis externa is made out of two smooth muscles. One is longitudinal, and the other one is circular. Okay. So that's one that actually produces what we call peristalsis. So the muscle that goes along the tube, okay, straight with the tube is your longitudinal muscle, and the one that wraps around the tube, those are your circular muscle, and that's called the muscularis externa. And the last is the outer covering of your alimentary canal, and that's going to be the serosa. It's also made out of epithelium and connective tissue. Okay. And those are the different layers of our alimentary canal. Okay. Now, let's take a look at the anatomy of the mouth. Okay. Remember, the anatomy of the mouth, the lips and the cheeks made out of your orbicularis oris muscle. That's from the lips, and then the buccinator on the cheeks. Okay. And then the mouth, which is the oral cavity, is made of stratified squamous epithelium non-keratinized. Okay. And remember, you have epithelium, you have lamina propria. All right, within this area of the mouth, we have teeth. Okay, so the purpose of teeth is to help in the digestive process. It's attached onto the maxillary bone and also at the mandibular bone. So the structures that we can actually see in the mouth, the teeth, okay, and remember the roof is divided into a hard palate and the soft palate. Okay, and the one that dangles at the bottom from the soft palate is what we call the uvula. Right. So you can see the tonsils located to the side of the mouth. Okay, these are what we call your palatine tonsils. Then the tongue, you lift the tongue, you have these ducts from the salivary gland. So this is duct from the submandibular gland. Okay, and that's actually the reason why you constantly have some saliva in your mouth to prevent it from drying out. Okay, and then the gingiva or the gums is associated where the teeth is attached. Okay, so now let's take a look at your tongue first. Okay, so the tongue has papillae. Okay, there's three of them. The only thing from the three papillae is the filiform papillate. They do not have taste buds. Remember, the purpose of the tongue is for taste. So the filiform papillae, they're distributed along the upper portion of the tongue. So that's the one that will actually make it rough. Okay, so that when food is actually in the mouth, the tongue can literally grab on the food because we have a lot of salivary glands that will secrete the mucus, and it's going to actually be difficult for the tongue to grab on the food, but the filiform papillae are like ridges that allows grabbing on the food through your tongue because the tongue will literally move the food around the mouth, okay, and will make it like a ball, okay. The tongue is literally sculpting it like a ball, B-A-L-L, okay. So that's called the filiform papillae. Now, if you notice, cats have filiform papillae. The filiform papillae is actually bigger and longer. And that's the reason why cats, they actually lick their fur in order to groom themselves. Okay? So that's what the cats do. They lick their fur and groom themselves. And at the end of the grooming, they'll cuff out big fur ball. Okay? And that's because the filiform papillae is used by the cats for that advantage. And they're more longer in cats and animals. Now, the other papillae is going to be the fungiform and syngiform. The late papillae, this have taste buds. Okay, those are taste buds. It's taste buds. Okay, and the fungiform is located along the upper portion of the tongue. They're scattered around the upper portion of the tongue, and then there's going to be taste buds to the back of the tongue that is called circumvallate. Circumvallate is located in the back of the tongue, but the fungiform is scattered along the entire upper portion of the tongue. And those are your taste buds. Okay. Now, if you take a look at the back of the mouth, okay, I'm sorry, the back of the tongue, there's also tonsils there. Okay. And that tonsil is called lingual tonsils. And you can see the palatine tonsils to the side of the mouth. That's your palatine tonsils. Okay. All right, so we've actually identified, we need to identify the tongue. So next is going to be your teeth. Okay. So the teeth, we're going to divide it into the deciduous teeth, or what we call baby teeth. And the other one's going to be permanent teeth. Okay. Deciduous teeth, there's 20 of this in children. Okay. Teeth first appear at 6 months of age. Okay. They first appear at 6 months of age. Now they become permanent, so they become 32. Okay. So for the deciduous teeth, the incisors, okay, this is going to be the formula of the deciduous teeth. There's 2 incisors. There's going to be 1 canine and 2 molars. Okay. So the total is 20 because that's only one side of one portion of the group. So for the permanent teeth, okay, it's actually made out of 3 incisors, 1 canine, okay, 2 premolars, and 3 molars, okay. So the total is going to be 32. So multiply 8 times 4, that'll be 32, okay. So what's actually important here is the third molar, and that third molar is called the wisdom tooth, okay. So that erupts between 17 to 25, okay. So that's going to be your wisdom tooth. All right, so this is what the teeth looks like. Okay, so let's take a look at what is composed of the layers of teeth. The outer portion, exposed portion, is made out of enamel. Okay, and then after that, the second is going to be dentine. And inside this dentine is called the pulp cavity. So animal, dentine, and the pulp cavity. Okay? And within those pulp cavity is where the nerves and blood vessels located at. That is called the root canal. Okay? So that's called the root canal. So if you know that you're going to have a root canal, that's what they're going to be doing is drill a hole there and cover that hole. Okay? And that will actually kill off the nerves. Okay? Now, the teeth are also divided of the exposed area called the neck and the crown, and the one embedded into the alveolar socket of the bone is called the root. Okay? And underneath the teeth, the exposed area, okay, is going to be the gums. All right. So now let's take a look at what's inside the mouth. We have the salivary glands. Okay, and remember there's three of them. The parotid gland. Okay, the parotid gland is located just in front of the ear. Then we have the submandibular gland. That's underneath the mandible. And then there's another one called the sublingual glands. That's underneath the tongue. Okay, it's underneath the tongue. All right, so those are the three parts, three salivary glands. Those are the accessory glands that are located in the mouth. And they produce saliva, but it also has an enzyme called the salivary amylase. And that's the reason why we consider the mouth, because of the saliva, as the start of digestion. Okay, so we have those three salivary glands. Okay, so we'll take a look at the pharynx. So the area of the pharynx, where the oral cavity is located at, that's going to be your oral pharynx. And the area of the pharynx, where the larynx is located at, that's going to be the laryngeal pharynx. Okay, so the laryngeal pharynx, we got the oral pharynx. Okay, and remember at the back of the respiratory tube is the esophagus. Okay, the esophagus have muscles located on top of it. And those muscles are what we call the pharyngeal constrictor muscles, superior, middle, and inferior. And that's one of the reasons why whenever you push the food by your tongue to the back of the pharynx, the swallowing process starts, in which the throat is being pulled by the hyoid bone and the esophagus is pulled along with it. So the muscles located at the upper portion of the esophagus will then grab the food and push it down into the esophagus. So these are different sections between the pharynx and the oral cavity and pharynx and the larynx. Okay, so now we finished with the esophagus. Okay, now we're actually going down into the stomach. Okay, so we have regions in the stomach. Okay, so the cardiac region, okay, which we call cardia, is actually a region where the esophagus and stomach meets. Okay. This part of the stomach that has a dome-shaped structure, call it a fundus, okay? That's going to be the fundal region, okay? And then after that, we have the body, okay? The body region of the stomach, and at the terminal portion of the stomach, the distal portion, we call it the pyloric region, okay? So those are the regions in your stomach. Now, the cardiac region, there's actually a valve that exists here in the cardiac region. And that valve is called your cardiac sphincter. But it's very famous more on the name, your gastroesophageal sphincter. Okay, and then there's another sphincter at the distal end of the stomach. That sphincter is called the pyloric sphincter. Okay. So why do you have two sphincters at the proximal and the distal end? Okay, because remember, the stomach has acid. Okay, and the esophagus and the duodenum, which is a structure after the stomach, they cannot survive with that acid because they don't have the protection of what the stomach has. Okay, which is mucus secretions that protects the walls of the stomach. Okay, so that's the reason why the sphincters are constantly closed on each side. Okay, in order to prevent the acid from spilling into the duodenum, into the esophagus, because when the acid regurgitates back into the esophagus, we call it gastroesophageal reflux disease. It can burn the walls of the esophagus. And remember, the walls of the esophagus, once it becomes burned, it can produce cancer. Okay? So we want to avoid that. Okay, that's the reason why we sometimes give your anti-hydrochloric acid. Okay, in order to prevent too much secretion of the acid in the stomach, because if it regurgitates back to the esophagus, it can actually produce destruction of the walls of the esophagus. The same thing as the duodenum. Now, the duodenum has a couple of things that protects it, because when the chyme that comes out from the stomach is now brought into the duodenum, then there's a little bit of acid there. Okay? But the duodenum takes some fluid that is called your bicarbs from the secretion of the pancreas. So the pancreas will secrete bicarb, and it will actually neutralize the acid that passes into the duodenum. Okay? So that's its own protection. All right, so now let's actually take a look at some of the structures again on the stomach. Okay, so we looked at the regions. Okay, now we look at the sphincter. Then we're going to take a look at the layers. Okay, so the layers that wraps around the stomach is made out of muscle called musculus externa. So they're actually made out of 3 muscles. Okay, so generally the alimentary canal is 2, but here we have 3 because remember the stomach's purpose is to ruminate the food inside. Okay, if you notice also, it is the walls are actually rough, called the rugae. So when the food is actually regurgitating around the stomach like a washing machine, it's going to hit to the wall in the stomach called rugae, and will further pulverize the food, okay, to become chyme. Okay, it's just like a washboard. So that's what the rugae is for. All right, so we have 3 muscles. The muscle that follows the length of the stomach is called longitudinal. The one that wraps, and that's the first layer. The one that wraps around, that's called circular, second layer. And the last layer is going to be the third layer that goes in an angle, called oblique layer. Okay, so those are the 3 layers. Okay, and if you take a look at the outside of the stomach, you have curvatures. This is lesser curvature. This is the greater curvature. And then at the distal end of the stomach, we got segments there. The first segment of the pylorus is called the pyloric antrum. Okay, antrum is an opening. And then after that, it goes through what we call the pyloric canal, which passes through a valve called your pyloric valve. Okay, and then from there, it goes into the duodenum. Okay, so that's actually the structure of the stomach, right? So very simple. Anatomy is not as difficult on this part. So we went back to the esophagus after the stomach because we're looking at the cardiac sphincter. The cardiac sphincter closes the lumen to prevent stomach acid from entering the esophagus. As I said, it can destroy the walls of the esophagus. So the continuation of the pharynx is the esophagus. The esophagus joins the stomach inferior to the diaphragm. And the esophagus is made out of stratified squamous epithelium. And there's mucus glands in that esophagus, and there's muscle that actually wraps around the esophagus. But the first third of that muscle is made out of skeletal muscle. It's actually voluntary control. Okay. The outside covering is called the external layer adventitia. And that's for the esophagus, okay? So in regards to the stomach, there's 3 layers of that muscle, like I said, circular, longitudinal, and oblique. The epithelium there is now simple columnar epithelium, and what's inside of those rugae are pits, and we call it gastric pits. Okay. Now the gastric pits has glands deep within the pits. Okay, and remember the purpose of the stomach will actually be revealed because what does this gland actually secrete is what the function of the stomach is. Okay, so these are your rugae. Then within the rugae are pits. And if I follow the pits, okay, I see three different cells within that pit. So we got one of these holes called gastric pits. Inside the pits are the gastric glands, okay, mostly located in the fundus and the body. So the mucus neck cells secretes mucus, a special type of secretion that covers the walls of the stomach to prevent the walls of the stomach from being injured by the acid secretion. So the mucus helps in its destruction. Okay. Now the next one we have parietal and your chief cells. Okay. Parietal cells secrete hydrochloric acid and the GIF, gastrointrinsic factor. This is responsible for the absorption of vitamin B. Okay. So GIF is secreted by the parietal cells in those pits, okay, which is located within the gastric gland region. Okay, so the opening is called the pits, and the gland region is actually the deep portion. Now, another cell that actually secretes pepsinogen, which is an enzyme on protein, it's called the chief cells. Okay, so those are the three cells that produce a secretion within those gastric glands below the pits, and they're called mucus neck cells, using special mucus. Parietal cells secrete hydrochloric acid and the gastrointrinsic factor, and the chief cell, that's one that secretes the pepsinogen, which is actually an enzyme for protein digestion. Okay, so those are the cells located in those glands deep down from the pits. Okay, so now let's go to the small intestinal tract. Okay, so in the small intestinal tract, we divide it into three parts. Okay, so this is the longest portion of the alimentary canal. Okay, but if you go stretch your intestinal tract from end to end, it actually becomes 30 feet. That's how long your intestinal tract is. Okay, so the small intestine is the site of enzymatic digestion and absorption. Mainly, the enzymatic digestion is located at the duodenum, and absorption is located by the jejunum and ileum. Okay. All right, so now let's take a look at the first small intestinal tract. That's going to be your duodenum. So this is the duodenum. It's a small C-shaped structure after the stomach. Okay. So if you notice, the duodenum receives secretion from the gallbladder and the pancreas. Okay. But the gallbladder receives secretion also from the liver. So remember, the liver will process the food located at your will process food that is served by hepatic portal vein, and whatever is rejected is going to become bile. Okay, bile also is the one that's being secreted by the liver into the ducts towards the gallbladder and the duodenum. So first duct that is connected to the liver is called the hepatic duct. And remember, it's right and left. It's on the patient's side. Okay, right and left hepatic ducts. Then the two hepatic ducts becomes one. That's going to be called the common hepatic duct. And then remember, bile usually is stored in the gallbladder. So now the bile travels through the cystic duct and stored in the gallbladder. Okay. Now, what allows the bile to be secreted? When your duodenum sends fats in their nutrients that are being absorbed, it's going to actually produce a hormone, okay, called cholecystokinin. But remember, that's physiology. We're doing anatomy. So that hormone will then tell the gallbladder to squeeze the bile inside. So the bile now squeezed from the gallbladder will pass through the cystic duct. And then from the cystic duct, it's going to be called the bile duct. And then it goes to the duodenum. Okay? So sometimes it's commonly called the common bile duct. Okay? So it actually goes into the duodenum in order to further assist in the digestion of fats. Okay. Now there's actually going to be ducts coming in from the pancreas. And remember, this duct is actually the one that produces your enzymes. It has the main pancreatic duct that exits out to get rid of bile duct. And then we have another duct called the accessory pancreatic duct that only secretes by itself into the duodenum. Okay, so this part here, in which the bile duct and the pancreatic duct exits out into the duodenum, we call it the ampulla, hepatopancreatic ampulla. Okay, and projection is called the papilla. All right, now we've actually finished what we've seen in your accessory organs, pancreas and the gallbladder. Okay, they're the one that secretes your enzymes for the pancreas and bile from the gallbladder. And they go into the duodenum. After it passes through the duodenum, okay, now it's going to go to the jejunum ileum. Okay, so remember the jejunum ileum is actually the place where the absorbable units, now they're actually being very functional units that can be absorbed, such as glucose, is going to go to the blood. Amino acid from proteins goes to the blood. The fatty acid, okay, that is actually coming from fats, they don't go to the blood. They actually go into the lymphatic system. Remember we talked about this, the lymphatic system, and this is called the intestinal trunk. Then from the intestinal trunk, it now goes into the thoracic duct, into the mesothelial vein. Okay? And we'll see some of those pictures on the slides too. All right, so now if I see the wall of your small intestinal tract, I see a lot of these folds. Okay, those folds are called circular folds, or what we call pita circularis. Those are transverse ridges of the mucosa and the submucosa. So they actually go around the small intestinal tract. Okay, and then if I take a look at on the folds, you can see something projecting upward. Okay, like fingers, and that is what we call the villi. So villi are just extension going upward into the lumen of your small intestinal tract. That's called the villi, finger-like projection. And then if I take a look at the cells that lines the villi, magnify it, the cells has its extensions also above the apical surface of the epithelium. That is now called the microvilli. Okay? So what is the purpose of this circular folds, villi, and the microvilli? It actually increases the absorptive surface, because at this point you're trying to absorb whatever you can as fast as you can. Okay? So you got a lot of surfaces that can actually go from the wall, which is the columnar epithelium, then goes to the blood vessel. Okay? Remember, the blood vessel that carries that nutrient is going to go to the hepatic portal vein and then goes to the liver. Okay? So those are the things that I see at your small intestinal tract. Okay? So let's actually finish up with the large intestine. So what does the large intestine be for? It is actually now digested residue or non-absorbable matter that is passed on to the large intestine, and we call it feces. Okay? So we're not doing anything with those things that are actually absorbed, that are located in the large intestinal tract. But remember, the food located in the large intestinal tract, there's still some water there and some electrolytes. So the food is, there could be some absorption that's happening in the large intestinal tract. Some absorption of water and electrolytes, such as when you become dehydrated, it's going to take some of the water out from the large intestinal tract, from the feces, okay? And that's the reason why, if you are constipated, okay, you actually maintain and you retain the food in your large intestinal tract for 2 or 3 days, so the body will keep on reabsorbing the water there. Now the feces is now going to be hard, like stone, okay? That's one of the reasons why it needs to be expelled every day, okay? Because what is in your large intestinal tract? It's in waste. And remember, waste can irritate the walls of the large intestinal tract, and that can induce cancer, okay? And also within the large intestinal tract, you also have bacteria there, okay? So you have a balance of good bacteria and the bad bacteria, okay? So your good bacteria are the one that you call lactobacilli, okay? You see it at your advertisements, okay? Your probiotics. So there's actually bacteria there, okay? There's bad bacteria also there. So the good bacteria are actually minimizing the growth of bad bacteria. Right? So that's exactly what it is on your large intestine. Okay. So let's identify the structures that we see in the large intestine. So now I'm looking at this structure of the large intestine. So I'm going to follow it into the opening from the ileum into a valve called the ileocecal valve, and it goes down to the cecum. The cecum is a round pouch. Okay, that's the first structure where food now passes through the large intestinal tract. It's a blind sac where the ileum would actually dump its digestive products, okay, down into the cecum. Now, if you notice, there's a thing that dangles down the bottom here called the appendix. Okay, so the appendix is actually located at the area of the cecum. Now, after the cecum, okay, which is the blind pouch, the colon now divides into segments. Okay, so the colon goes as ascending, then and then transverse colon. Okay, the part here at the corner between the ascending and the transverse, that's called the right colic flexure, or what we call hepatic flexure. Okay, and then from the transverse, it then goes into descending. Okay, so the part where it forms the transverse and the descending, that is called the left colic flexure, or what we call the splenic flexure. And then from the descending, it becomes an S-shaped colon or the sigmoid. And after that becomes a pouch or the rectum. And the opening from the rectum is going to be the anal canal. Okay, anal canal. Okay, so that we trace the path of your large intestinal tract. So identify the appendix, rectum, and anal canal. Now, what are the special features of the large intestine? The teniculi. If you take a look at the teniculi, okay, so let me erase a couple of these labels. The teniculi are thickening of longitudinal muscularis. So this is actually a thickened longitudinal muscles. That's called the teniculi. You only see it here at the large intestinal tract. Okay? And the hostras are the puckering created by the teniculi. So each segment of this is called a hostra. Okay? And that's the reason why it looks like sausages, right? So that's called a hostra. And then within the teniculi are fat-filled pouches that is also part of the visceral peritoneum. That's called epiploic appendicus. So these fat-filled pouches, they're called epiploic appendicus. Okay? So those are the things that I see in your large intestinal tract. Okay? So we identify the large intestinal tract. And then we're actually looking at the anus now, okay? So, I'm sorry, this is actually what it looks like in the large intestinal tract. You still have your simple preliminary epithelium, and then within that you also have crypts, okay? Within the large intestinal, we call it intestinal crypts, but it has tubules or glands, simple tubular glands that are located within those crypts, okay? Remember, they also secrete mucus, the same thing as what the stomach does, in order to actually make the surface prevented from any injury. Okay. Now, we've actually finished with your large intestine wall. Okay. So we actually now at the anus. Okay. So the anus is actually the terminal canal. Okay, where feces passes through. So the main thing about the anal canal, it has two sphincters, external anal sphincter and the internal anal sphincter. The internal anal sphincter is not under your control. So when the rectum senses fullness, it will actually tell the brain, hey, open up the sphincter. So the internal anal sphincter will open up. Okay? But the good thing is you have the external anal sphincter, which is under your control. So that allows you to be able to actually prevent an accident. So be able to run into the toilet, okay? And that's what the anus is, okay? Now, before we actually finish, let me just finish a couple of accessory organs, okay? The accessory organ we're looking at is the liver, okay? So remember, the liver has a lot of functions in the hepatocyte, the cells in the liver. Their main function is they manufacture blood proteins, they produce bile, okay? in the from the detoxified poison that passes from the hepatic portal. Okay, detoxifies also alcohol. That's the reason why whenever somebody drinks a lot of alcohol, it will always pass through the liver, and the liver will detoxify it. So if you constantly have a lot of this alcohol, the liver will become damaged, and that's called alcoholic liver cirrhosis. Okay. So we have a lot of the function in there, and it's a lot of mitochondria because there's a lot of liver processes, and there's actually sugar that's stored in your liver. So if you got too much of the carbohydrate you ate, somehow it's going to be stored because it's going to be absorbed, and you ate too much of the carbohydrate, the liver, together with the muscle, stores that sugar in the form of glycogen. Call it glycogen. Okay, and the liver has a great capacity for regeneration, apparently. Okay. So that's one concept. We actually knew that only epithelium regenerates, but the liver has regeneration capacity also because it's lined by hepatocytes, which are similar to epithelial cells. Okay, and the main purpose of the liver generally is to process the food coming out from the hepatic portal. Okay, so this is where the food comes in, hepatic portal vein, going into the liver, and then the liver will detoxify what it has through its hepatocytes, and then from there, everything is actually okay. So the hepatocytes are lining the sinusoids. So whatever liver has, it will let it pass through the sinusoids. And then the liver actually allows that thing that passes through them will then connect to the hepatic vein. Then from the hepatic vein it goes to the inferior vena cava. Okay? And then we have also arteries that are located in the liver. Okay, and that artery is for giving oxygenated blood to the cells there. And then the last part here is going to be the gallbladder. Okay, the ducts of the gallbladder. Okay, and that's the reason we call it the triad. Triad here is called the porta hepatis, made out of the hepatic portal vein, hepatic artery, in the ducts. Okay, that's located in the liver. Okay. So aside from that, let's actually take a look at the structures that we need to identify in the liver. Okay, we got lobes on the liver. This is on the left lobe of the liver. Remember, the left lobe is smaller than the right lobe of the liver. The right lobe of the liver is on the right side of the abdominal cavity. Okay. Now, the left lobe and the other lobes of the liver is divided in the area where the falciform ligament passes through. Remember, the falciform ligament is a ventral mesenteric. Now, we identified the left lobe, we identified the right lobe, and the lobe here on top is caudate lobe. Okay, remember, I'm looking at the back of the liver. Okay, I'm not looking at the front of the liver. I'm looking at the back of the liver because I see the gallbladder. When I see the gallbladder is located at the back of the liver. Okay, in the front, you won't be able to see as much the gallbladder is. But I'm looking at the back here. Okay, and then the next lobe here looks like square, called quadrate lobe. Okay, they're called the quadrate lobe. Now, the skill that you have to know is how to identify the ducts of the gallbladder. So the ducts of the gallbladder, this is a duct from the liver. Liver means hepatic. This is another duct from the liver. So since this is at the area of the left lobe, we're going to call it the left hepatic duct. And this duct is located at the right lobe. We're going to call it the right hepatic duct. The two ducts becomes one, or the common hepatic duct. And then remember, it's going to be stored into the gallbladder and pass by the cystic duct to the gallbladder. And then when the duodenum sends flaps, it's going to secrete the hormone called cystokinin that will squeeze the gallbladder out into the cystic duct. And then, it's going to squeeze the bile from the gallbladder to the cystic duct. And then from there, it's going to be called the common bile duct or just simple bile duct. The bile duct connects to the duodenum. Okay, so those are structures we see in the liver, and we identify the gallbladder's different ducts. Okay, now let's take a look at that part there where the gallbladder came from. It came from the liver. That's right and left hepatic duct. Okay, this is the common hepatic duct. This is the cystic duct to the gallbladder. The bile excretes from the gallbladder to the cystic duct, and from the cystic duct goes to the common bile duct, or bile duct, to the duodenum. Okay, now that is what the gallbladder path of the flow of bile. Okay, so if you take a look at this part here, we're going to be, and remember I said cholecystokinin, that's all released by the duodenum because it sends fats. Now this one tells you about the pancreas. Okay, the pancreas has cells inside that produces what we call enzymes. But remember, it also has cells called your islet cells, islet of Langerhans cells. These are the ones that produces your hormone. Okay. Islet of Langerhans, the alpha creates glucagon, and the beta produces your insulin. And remember, the secretion here is done through the blood, okay, not through the ducts. So that's going to be the integrated part of it. They control the sugar level of the body. The sinus cells create enzymes, okay? Remember, the sinus cells will actually secrete into the main pancreatic duct. And then it has two ducts which go into the bile duct. It's going to be the main pancreatic duct. And then this is going to be an accessory pancreatic duct. Okay? All right, so now we finished with everything. Digestive tract, accessory organs, and that finishes a chapter that is called digestive system. Okay, your models. Okay, it's going to be first one. It's going to be the salivary gland. Okay, so the salivary gland located in front of the ear. That's your parotid, and the one underneath the mandible. This is the mandible. Underneath that is called submandibular. In order for me to show you the sublingual, I need to cut that mandible in order to be able to see the gland underneath the tongue, and that's going to be your sublingual gland. Okay, and there's submandibular located here. All right, so this is the stomach. Okay, and remember the stomach is divided in regions. You have the cardiac region. You have the fundus region. So the fundus region is the dome-shaped structure located at the proximal part of the stomach. And then you have the body region, and you have the pyloric region, the distal end of the stomach. Now there's two curvatures on the outside of the stomach. This is your lesser curvature, and this one is going to be the greater curvature. Remember, mesenteric attaches to those curvature, and they're actually named based on the name of the curvature, like lesser omentum for the lesser curvature, and then greater omentum for the greater curvature. Right, so now we're looking at the inside of the stomach. Those ridges that you see in the walls of the stomach, those are called rugae. Okay, and remember, inside those rugae are gastric pits. Okay, those are gastric pits, and we found out that gastric pits have mucus, neck cells, so they're creating mucus, and there's another one that's called your parietal cell, which secretes hydrochloric acid and your gastrin intrinsic factor that absorbs for the purpose of absorbing vitamin B. Then we have the chief cells. They're the one that secretes the enzyme called pepsinogen. Okay, those are the ones located at the rugae. It has pits. Now, this is a valve called the pyloric sphincter. Okay, so that is where the stomach connects with the duodenum. Okay, and then these are called your circular folds located at the small intestine called plica circularis. Okay, so the purpose is that to increase the surface of the duodenum. Now, this is another picture of the stomach. Okay, so we got your fundus region, body, cardiac region, and pyloric region. Okay, so the esophagus connects with the stomach in the cardiac region, and we call that sphincter cardiac sphincter. And then you've noticed that the walls of the stomach has root gates. Okay, those are raised ridges in the lining of the walls of the stomach. And then your pyloric region is actually divided into the antrum, meaning the opening, then the canal, and the pylorus valve, pyloric valve. Okay. And then we see again the lesser curvature and the greater curvature. Now this one is another picture of the stomach. Okay, so it actually was the same, those are similar to what we actually saw on the previous ones. I want to concentrate here on the smooth muscles that wraps around the stomach. Okay, these are longitudinal muscles, follows the length of the muscle. Okay, and your circular muscles, that's actually the one that wraps around the muscle. And the one that is the inner would be the oblique. So three muscles that are located in the stomach. Okay, now let's take a look at this one again. Let's concentrate on your muscle, smooth muscles, longitudinal, circular, and obliques. Now, again, this shows you about the stomachs, the model with the description, but I'm going to actually concentrate on the muscles that are actually lining the stomach. Okay, 519 is actually the lesser curvature, but that's going to be also the longitudinal muscles. Okay, so 521 is literally the longitudinal. So it follows the length of the stomach. Longitudinal. And then 522 is going to be the circular. And then 523, those are your obliques, okay, which are inner lining. All right, now we're looking at the small intestine, and remember we've noticed that the small intestine has those circular folds. So within the tube of the small intestine, you can see inside are circular folds. The circular folds are called the plicae circularis. And then within the plicae circularis, you can see some villi within those circular folds. Okay, those are called your villi. And in the villi, you have this intestinal crypts, okay, so, which is similar to the gastric crypts. But the intestinal crypts, what they have is actually mostly the mucus secreting glands. Okay? And then the lining of the intestinal wall is called columnar epithelium. Okay. Now this is the one that I want to show you, which is going to be number 6. After the lining of the intestinal wall, we got number 6. Those are your capillaries. Remember, there's the one that will absorb your nutrients that will be carried down to the hepatic portal vein. And then from the hepatic portal vein, it will then go into the liver. Right? And those are for glucose and amino acids, okay? But as I said, fats is not going through the capillaries. Fats are directly carried by lacteals. Lacteals is part of the lymphatic system. So the lymphatic system will carry those fats that are absorbed. And remember, that part is called the intestinal trunk of the lymphatic system. And this is actually carried by your cisterna shalai. Then from the cisterna shalai, it will go to the thoracic duct. Then from the thoracic duct passes into the subclavian vein, the left subclavian vein. Okay, so those are the things that you see on the villi of the small intestine, and the muscularis externa, which is made out of circular muscularis, the deep layer, and then the outer layer is called the longitudinal muscularis. Okay, so we divided your intestinal tube into the mucosa, then submucosa, then your muscularis externa, and the outside lining called the serosa. Okay, that's another picture, and this one is actually having to do with the same levels. That's what we did. Okay, another villi. Okay, and it's the same things that we actually described from the previous model. Now this one is actually the stomach again, the internal anterior view. Okay, so what I want you to look at is actually the things that's happening sometimes in the stomach called gastric ulcer. And there's going to be something like the duodenal ulcer. Okay, remember, ulcers are actually not really caused by acid. Okay, it's actually caused by a bacterial infection called H. pylori. Okay, so that's actually the reason why people would produce gastric ulcers because of H. pylori. So if you have hyperacidity, okay, don't say you have ulcers, because the only time I can say you have an ulcer is when I look inside with a tube called the gastroscopy. An endoscope, if I see an ulcer there, that's the definite diagnosis of ulcer. Okay, but it's just hyperacidity. It's just hyperacidity so far. The pancreas. Okay, if you take a look at the pancreas, it has a head, neck, body, and tail. So the head can be divided into the head proper and the uncinate process. Okay, so those are the divisions of the pancreas. Now, where's the head facing? The head is facing towards the duodenum. And where's the tail facing? It's facing towards the spleen. The spleen and the duodenum does not have any connection. Okay, it's just where it's located at. Now, if you notice that the pancreas has the ducts, the main pancreatic duct, and sometimes we have a very, very scientific name for that called the Wilson canal, Wilson. Then the accessory pancreatic duct has a scientific name called the duct of Santorini. Okay, so Santorini, accessory pancreatic duct, Wilson, main pancreatic duct. Right? Another picture of the pancreas in relation to the duodenum and the spleen. Okay, so same labels that we actually went through. And another of those picture of the pancreas with the duodenum and the spleen in relationship. Okay, now do you see the folds that are located in that duodenum? Those are called plica circularis, or what we call circular folds. And the purpose of that is to increase absorptive surface. Now this one is now the pancreas in relationship to the structures of the abdominal organs. Okay, so again, this is the connection of the stomach to the duodenum. Inside is plica circularis. Okay, and then you see the pancreas. Pancreas looks like the fist punching onto the duodenum. That's why it actually creates a letter C on the duodenum. And that's going to be the pancreas. And that is the one that enters its secretion into the main pancreatic duct. And this is the accessory pancreatic duct. Now, in this picture, you can actually see where the bile duct enters. Okay, the bile duct also enters in with the main pancreatic duct. Okay, so that's actually coming out from your gallbladder. Now, this is actually a histology of the pancreas. All the cells that you see here lining a tube, okay, those cells are actually called acinar cells. They're the one that creates enzymes, okay? And this enzyme goes through the pancreatic ducts, okay? But the one that you see here, like islands, located in the tissue of the pancreas, Those are what we call islet of Langerhans. They're the one that carries the hormones. The alpha, islet of Langerhans, they carry glucagon. Remember, glucagon increases sugar in the blood. In the beta, they're the one that carries insulin. And they're the one that decreases sugar in the blood. So two hormones created by the pancreas, aside from creating hormones, they also create enzymes. Now, this gives you a picture of the stomach connecting through the duodenum. And then the duodenum receives the ducts of the gallbladder and the pancreatic duct. Okay? Pancreatic duct has the main and the accessory. All right, so now this is something that you have to analyze, okay? So I want to ask you, am I looking at the inner of this model, which is made out of the jejunum and ileum and large intestine? So your landmark to identify this is look for the appendix. The appendix is usually located at the right lower quadrant, okay? So I'm looking at it from the front. The appendix will always be at the right lower quadrant. So whatever you see here is jejunum and ileum. Okay? Now the back of the jejunum ileum is the one that holds it to the ventral wall. That's going to be mesentery. Okay? So I want you to take note of this. Because later on you can see a model in which the jejunum and ileum is removed and the only thing you see is the mesentery. Or this model is turned reverse, so you look at the back of this model, okay? So in this case, I always use my landmark going to be called the appendix, okay? If I see the appendix, I'm looking at and it's on the right side, I'm looking at the front of this model. This is the ileum connecting to a valve called ileocecal valve, which connects to this first part of the large intestine called the cecum. And remember, the appendix dangles below the cecum. So this would be your ascending colon, transverse, descending colon to the sigmoid, then goes to the rectum. Okay, so this is a picture of the anterior view. Another picture of the anterior view focusing on the appendix that dangles below the cecum. You have those circular folds. This is the ileum connecting into the cecum through what we call the ileocecal valve. And these are your jejunum plus ileum. And I'm looking at it on the front part of the model because my appendix is on the right lower quadrant. So I'm looking at the anterior view of this model. Okay. Again, this is the anterior view of the model. I see the cecum with not visible in the appendix, but the cecum is always in the right side. Okay, so this is going to be my ascending, transverse. Okay, and these are my jejunum and ileum. Now this structure that looks like an apron cut in half. Okay, it covers the anterior part of the model. That's your greater omentum. Okay, then this longitudinal muscle thickened area of the large intestine, that's called the tinea coli. They're the one that will create the rostrum. They're called rostrums. Right? So another view. Okay, now take a look at this model. Am I looking at the anterior view or the posterior view? Okay. Now my landmark is my appendix. Now it's on the right side. It's actually on the left side of the model here, but I'm looking at the right side, okay? So I'm looking at the back of this model. So because the appendix now is on the opposite side, okay? So I'm looking at the back of the model. So the front of this model is going to be the jejunum ileum. It's not seen here because I'm looking at the back. So what attaches the jejunum ileum to the back wall? They're called your mesentery proper. Okay, so that means that my appendix is here, cecum is here. This is my ascending, my transverse, and my descending. This will be sigmoid. Okay. So again, you got to visualize it and be able to actually identify your appendix where it is. Okay. Remember, your regular appendix is usually on the right side of the patient. Okay. And this model is also still on the right side of the patient. I'm looking at it from the back. Okay, so take note of this difference. Now, this is the sigmoid attaching to the rectum. Then from the rectum, it goes to the anus. Okay, this is the bladder. That's for the urinary system. Right? Now, this model, okay, again, decipher this. Okay, I see my appendix here. Okay, so what's supposed to be here, but it's not in the right side of the model. So what I'm looking at is the back of this model. So that means that this is my ascending and this is my descending. Okay, because I'm using that appendix as my landmark. Okay, so what is here is the mesentery. Okay, so I'm looking at the back of this model. Okay, so I'm looking at the back of this model. Another picture. Now, I'm looking at the front of the model because I see the jejunum ileum on the front. Okay, so I couldn't see the appendix, so that means that this would be transverse. And this should be descending. Since I'm looking at the anterior view, I can identify the columns. This is the ascending. This is the rectum. This is the sigmoid. Okay. Now another picture. Okay. Now figure this out. Okay. And I look at the front or the back of this model. This is actually the front of the model because the appendix is on the right position, on the right side of the patient. Okay. But why don't I see the jejunum, the ileum here? Okay. The jejunum ileum was removed. That's why when I'm looking at this model, it's actually the back of this jejunum and ileum. Jejunum is not here. It was removed, but I'm still looking at the anterior view. So what you have here is going to be the mesentery. So there's actually the jejunum ileum supposed to be on top of this mesentery. But I'm looking at the front of the model. So that means this is the cecum, ascending colon, transverse, descending colon, sigmoid, and rectum. Okay. So again, the model's jejunum ileum was just removed, but it's actually looking at the anterior view. Okay. Now this one, am I looking at the back of the model or the front of the model? My landmark is my appendix. Now it's on this side now. Okay. It's supposed to be this side if I'm looking at the anterior view, but it's now on the other side. So what I'm looking at is the back of the model. Okay. This would be the mesentery. And at the back of the mesentery is going to be the jejunum, the ileum. Okay. But I'm looking at the posterior view. Okay. So this is posterior view. So that means that this is the appendix, the cecum. So this is ascending, transverse, descending, sigmoid, and rectum. Okay. All right, so now there's another thing that you have to analyze, okay? This is the liver. Usually, the anterior view of the liver, you don't see the gallbladder, okay? But I see the gallbladder, so I'm looking at the posterior view of the liver, okay? And if it's posterior view of the liver, I want to verify it, okay? Remember the liver, if I'm looking at the front, the right side of the liver is bigger than the left side. So the right side of the liver is bigger than the left side. Okay? So I'm going to confirm if this is looking at a posterior view. Okay? Now, this is the biggest part of the liver. So this is the right lobe of the liver. Okay? Now, this is the smallest part of the liver. This is the left lobe of the liver. There's 4 lobes. This is now the caudate lobe, and this is your quadrate lobe. It looks like a square, quadrate, okay? But we're not finished with that, okay? I need to identify the ducts that goes to the gallbladder. I got 2 ducts. This duct, since it's going to the left, I'm going to call it the left hepatic duct. And this duct, it came from the right. I'm going to call this the right hepatic duct. Okay, the 2 becomes 1. That's called the common hepatic duct. Remember, the bile created by the liver will be stored in the gallbladder, so this would be my, I'm sorry, okay, so let me actually orient myself again, okay? So we'll take the model, okay, and label the lobes, left lobe, right lobe, okay, caudate lobe, and quadrate lobe, okay? So I got 2 ducts, okay? This is not connected to the liver. It's free, it's floating. So this is not going to be a hepatic duct. I got the 2 ducts that are embedded onto the liver, okay? So this one is facing the left lobe. So this is my left hepatic, okay? Remember, I'm seeing the gallbladder, so I'm looking at the back view. This is my right hepatic duct. The 2 ducts becomes 1. That's going to be my common hepatic duct. Okay? Then remember, it's going to store it to the liver, to the gallbladder. That's going to be my cystic duct that goes to the gallbladder. And then with the squeeze, goes from the gallbladder to the cystic duct. And now this one is called the common bile duct, which has been cut. And this one is the one that will go to the duodenum. Okay? Always orient yourself. Make sure you actually base it on, if I'm looking at the liver, if I'm looking at the gallbladder, I'm looking at the posterior view, and confirm the lobes. The right lobe is bigger, the left lobe is smaller, okay? And that's how you identify the ducts. Now this one, I'm looking at the gallbladder, so I'm looking at the posterior view, okay? But I want to confirm it. The right lobe, the left lobe, and then this one is called the the caudate, and this is the quadrate. Remember, quadrate is square looking. Okay, and this separates the left and the other lobes. That's going to be the falciform ligament. Okay, now again, I'm going to identify the ducts again, posterior view, and identify my lobes. Okay, so I'm going to use yellow as my color. Okay, so I'm going to use the color yellow, identify the ducts. Now, this duct is embedded on the liver, and this duct is embedded on the liver. So this one, since it goes to the left lobe, it's called the left hepatic duct. And this one goes into the right lobe, so this is my right hepatic duct. Okay, and then they become 1. That's my common hepatic duct. And then after that, it has to go to the gallbladder to be stored. That's my cystic duct, and this is my gallbladder. Then from the gallbladder, it goes back to the cystic duct, and then goes out as my common bile duct that goes to the duodenum. Okay, so again, always do confirm, am I looking at the posterior view, or am I confirm with the right and left lobe? Now, this other one is actually a little bit tricky, because I'm seeing the gallbladder, okay, and the gallbladder So we said the gallbladder, if I see it, I'm looking at the posterior view, but I see the right lobe on this side. Because the right lobe is bigger and the left lobe is actually smaller. So that means I'm looking at the anterior view, but the liver was cut in half. That's the reason why I can see also the gallbladder. But this is the anterior view. Okay, so take note of this. Because I'm confirmed, if I see the gallbladder, I'm looking at the anterior view. Okay, and then confirm with the right lobe, the left lobe. Okay, but in this case, I'm seeing the gallbladder, but I'm looking at the similar to a posterior view because the right lobe is here and the left lobe is here. Okay, so that means that if I identify the duct, this duct embedded in the liver and this duct embedded in the liver, this that goes to the right lobe is the right hepatic duct. And this one that goes to the left lobe is the left hepatic duct. And this one is going to be where they join as one common hepatic duct. And then this one is a cystic duct that goes to the gallbladder. And then when it's squeezed, it goes from the gallbladder to the cystic duct, and this one goes to the common bile duct, which drains into the duodenum. Okay, so again, this is a unique situation because I'm looking at the anterior view, even though I've seen the gallbladder, because it is a coronal plane. Okay, so it is actually the coronal plane. That's the reason why I'm dependent on the lobes. The bigger lobe is the right, the smaller lobe is the left. That's how I identify the hepatic duct, right or left. Okay, following the lobes. So this is how it looks like. Okay, so this is my hepatic duct right, hepatic duct left, common hepatic duct. And this is going to be my cystic duct to the gallbladder, then from the gallbladder, cystic duct to the common bile duct. This is the same picture as we have here. And remember, the gallbladder is actually hidden at the back of the liver, okay? When I'm seeing the anterior view, the bigger lobe is right, the smaller lobe is left. So this tells me this is the right hepatic, this is the left hepatic. They become one, they become common hepatic, and then goes up to the cystic to go to the gallbladder. And then from the gallbladder, cystic, and down, common bile duct, into the duodenum. Okay? So that's how you identify the gallbladders, the duct. Again, I'm looking at the gallbladder, so I'm looking at the anterior view because the gallbladder is this one. I'm going to confirm the gallbladder is actually more likely to be located to the right lobe, and the opposite lobe is the left lobe. So this is quadrate lobe, and this is caudate lobe. Okay, so now we're going to identify the ducts. This one is embedded to the gallbladder towards the left. So this is my left hepatic duct. This one is embedded to the liver, embedded to the liver. That's my right hepatic duct. They become one to become the common hepatic duct. And then it goes to the cystic duct to the gallbladder. Then from the gallbladder, it goes to the cystic duct and comes out to become the common bile duct and goes to the duodenum. Okay, that's going to be the flow of the gallbladder. Okay, now I'm looking at the back, or I'm actually looking at the posterior view. This is the ventral portion. Okay, this is called the ventral. It's black color or blue. Okay, so now I'm going to confirm right lobe bigger, left lobe smaller. Okay, the gallbladder is mostly to be at the right lobe. Okay, the stomach is most likely will be at the left lobe. That's the reason it has called the gastric compression. So this is left lobe, right lobe, quadrate, caudate. Okay, So I got two ducts embedded on the liver. Okay, that's going to be my left hepatic. That's close to the left lobe. And this duct is my right hepatic. It goes to the right lobe. Then becomes one of the common hepatic duct. And then it goes to the cystic duct, goes to the gallbladder. Then from the gallbladder exits on to the cystic duct and it becomes the common bile duct, CBD. That's the one that can go to the duodenum. Okay? All right, so now let's take a little bit picture of the inside the liver. Okay, so this is what's inside the liver. Remember, this is going to be the hepatic portal vein. Okay, remember the hepatic portal vein drains that nutrients that are absorbed by the intestinal tract along the walls of the liver. These are the cells of the liver called hepatocytes. Okay, these are cells of the liver called hepatocytes. So they're the one who will process whatever went through those channels. The channels are called sinusoids, and there's actually cells there that are called Kupffer cells, and they're the one that are macrophages. So macrophages are cells that eat. Okay, so anything that's not supposed in the blood that's carried by the hepatic portal will be eaten by the Kupffer cells, hepatic portal vein. So it will pass through the sinusoids. The hepatocytes will process also whatever passed through the sinusoids. And then once it goes into the end, it will be dumped into the central vein. Central vein, all of the central vein will then go into the hepatic vein. And the hepatic vein will carry it to the inferior vena cava to the right atrium. Okay? The liver has a very, very important role in processing whatever is being absorbed by intestinal tract through the hepatic portal. And then whatever is actually dumped as waste by the hepatocytes, it will actually go to this channel that is connecting to the gallbladder. That is going to be the duct of the gallbladder. So duct of the gallbladder will then go into the duodenum, and it will then be part of the feces. Because remember, bile is made out of waste coming out from the liver that filters from the hepatic portal vein. So bile is then carried into the duodenum. It actually plays a role in the digestion of fats, but it is also the waste product of the liver. So then the bile will then be greenish, okay? And then it will follow to the flow of the intestinal tract. That green pigment will turn dark. And that's the reason why your feces is brown, because that green pigment by bile will turn dark, okay, to brown. That's why your feces is dark. So if your feces is pale, it means that you didn't secrete a lot of bile, okay? Your feces has to be brown, okay? And then if your feces is greenish, it means you have diarrhea, because the feces is actually flowing fast towards your anus. So that also tells us what kind of problems you have by looking at feces, okay?